Yeah.
Maybe that's me. Not them.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today to discuss the state of the news media and the future of the free press in our country. I'd like to start by acknowledging today's panel moderator, Sonia Gavankar. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the panel. And to all of our panelists, thank you so much for being here and for participating. We have Allison Bethel McKenzie, who is the Executive Director of the Society of Professional Journalists, Kate Nacera, DC Bureau Chief of BuzzFeed, Amy Mitchell, Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center, and David Luigi, President and Chief Executive Officer of Tegna, Inc. As the freedom of the press comes under a steady and worsening barrage of attacks, this is an extremely pressing and timely discussion of one of the most fundamental tenets of our democracy. There can be no doubt that a strong and free press is necessary for the well-being of our citizens and for the stability and strength of our democracy. Our nation's founders understood that self-governance requires an independent press to allow citizens to engage in free debate, exchange ideas, make informed decisions, and hold their government accountable. But as we've seen day in and day out, the freedom of the press is under attack. There has been a rise in claims of fake news against legitimate news organizations, and also a rise in actual disinformation created by provocateurs, partisans, foreign nations, and conspiracy theorists. Newsrooms are being depleted, especially at the local level. And we've seen diverging ideas silenced, like that of Pittsburgh Post-Gazette editorial cartoonist Rob Rogers, who worked at the paper for 25 years, but was fired last week by his new boss for being too critical of the president. Just this week, we heard the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen tell the American people, and this is a quote, "Don't believe the press." And perhaps most troubling of all, we have seen this president call the press, again a quote, "the enemy of the American people." It would be a mistake to consider these attacks as only focused on a single reporter, news outlet, or even just one industry. No, these attacks on the freedom and vitality of the press are attacks on the very core of our democracy, our freedom, and our capacity for governance. Thus, they are attacks on each and every one of us. Despite the significance of the threats facing the free press, it has been nearly 10 years since the United States Senate conducted a serious review of the state of our media and considered how best to sustain a free and vibrant press in the future. It's clear that we are long overdue for a national discussion about how to support journalism, not just in Washington, D.C., but also in state capitals and towns across our country. And I'm glad to host this forum today on how we best address the challenges facing the media. The future of our country depends on us working together to rediscover and recommit ourselves to the value of truth, so that Americans trust the organizations that are working to ensure that the American people are free and the powerful are accountable. I'll note that nowhere has the importance of a free press, or at no time has the importance of a free press been as clear as it is today, this week, when we consider what's happening to children on our border. And I am incredibly grateful to all journalists, but particularly those who have been absolutely persistent on the border, not only telling the American people what is happening, but also finding out what is happening to those children after they disappear from camera's view. So thank you all, members of the press who are here. Thank all journalists in our beloved country for what they do. I'm going to continue to push for a robust dialogue in Congress to ensure that we have a viable free press, and I really look forward to hearing from all of you about how we can move forward. Thank you. And now I'd like to hand our proceeding over to our moderator, Sonia Gavankar. Sonia is the Director of Public Relations at the Newseum and has spent her career in communications and media. So Sonia, thank you for being here and for moderating today's panel discussion.
Thank you, Senator, for convening us. I think it does seem like it could seem strange for a Director of Public Relations to be moderating this panel, but I started my career in journalism, and working for the Newseum, we are a champion for a free and fair press, and we want it to be vibrant, so I'm so excited to be having this conversation. Looking back at the conversation that was held 10 years ago, it seemed like we weren't sure what this world was going to look like in terms of press, and it seemed like there were going to be no newspapers. I think they had this thought that newspapers were going to completely have died out. That is luckily not the case, but it is definitely not what we thought it would be, the situation that we are in now. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I want to dive right in by introducing our panelists, starting with Allison Bethel McKenzie, the Executive Director of the Society of Professional Journalists. She has more than 35 years of experience as an award-winning reporter, bureau chief, senior editor, and media trainer. She has worked in senior-level positions at the Boston Globe, the Detroit News, Legal Times, and NASA Guardian in the Bahamas as managing director. She is co-founder and former vice president of the board of directors for the Media Institute of the Caribbean and acts as an advisor consultant for the Antillean.org news website in the Barbados. Thank you, Allison, for being here. Amy Mitchell is the Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center. She focuses on how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, how news organizations distribute information, and how technology is changing all of these elements. Mitchell specializes in how news technology is affecting news information today and the influence of political identity on the individual's choice of news, and has been researching the news landscape for more than 20 years. Amy, thank you. David Luigi is the president and chief executive officer of Tegna, Inc. It is a geographically diverse media company that reaches more than 50 million adults on air and 30 million across digital platforms each month. Dave spent 10 years as president of Tegna Media prior to becoming CEO. He serves as chairman of the NBC affiliate board and is the immediate past joint chairman of the National Association of Broadcasters, or NAB. He is also on the board of directors for BMI Broadcast Music, Inc., the Broadcasters Foundation of America, and is the past chair of the Television Bureau of Advertising Board of Directors. Thank you, Dave. And Kate Nocera is the DC Bureau Chief of BuzzFeed, Washington, D.C.'s bureau. Kate is the recipient of the National Press Foundation's 2014 Dirksen Award for Distinguished Reporting on Congress. Thank you, Kate. Okay, let's get right in. Amy, I want to start with you. Pew Research Center just this Monday released a report on the state of the news media looking at newspapers. In the past years, we've seen numbers decreasing or staying the same when it comes to circulation and viewership. Set the stage for this conversation and tell us briefly about the climate as we're looking at specifically newspapers.
Sure. be happy to. And we are in a continuing state of decline, even over the last year. If we look at 2017, total ad revenue has declined another 10% across newspapers. That leaves the industry at about a third of where they were just a decade ago. Weekday circulation, which is a combination of digital and print circulation, has also continued to fall, falling another 9% in the past year. Now, this is where we've seen some of the very large national newspaper organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others have shown increases in these areas over the last couple of years. But overall, for the industry, those are the exceptions, and the industry itself continues to fall. This then leads to what are overall smaller newsroom budgets and declines in newsroom personnel and employees. Newsroom employees fell 15% over the last 3 years, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And when we build that on top of our historical trends, they already had shown a 39% decline in full-time newsroom employees from 1994 through 2014. So when we think about how these play out, we're continuing to hear in our news reporting announcements of layoffs. And we did a number of different search techniques looking over the past year at layoffs at the newspapers, daily newspaper circulation of 50,000 or more. We found that over a third of them, about a third of them, have experienced layoffs just in the past year. So we think about how does this play out in the reporting. What that leads to is less boots on the ground overall in terms of doing the reporting. A study that we did that can sort of speak to these impacts was an audit of State House news reporters, those that are assigned to cover their State House, either full-time or part-time in some capacity. And we found, and this was in 2014, that even though newspapers still accounted for the largest portion overall, when you look at the different news media sectors, fewer than a third of daily newspapers had anybody, whether full-time or part-time, assigned to these state houses.
And that includes full-time and part-time?
Correct.
So that is a major change.
It's down, if we look at newspapers alone, it's down about 30% from when the study had been done previously.
But would you count that as major, or is this something that you're seeing that's following the same track of decline?
It is certainly following decline. We've not done this every year the way we've done some of our other research, but we saw something similar if you look at Washington Press Corps reporters, that we were at 29 states in 2014 that had a local newspaper that had anybody assigned here as a part of the Washington Press Corps. And it was actually niche outlets and digital natives that, for the first time we had seen, actually had more reporters here as the Washington Press Corps than did daily newspapers.
This is a conversation not just about newspapers. Local coverage is very important. Dave, talk to us about the trends that are happening in local newsrooms across this country.
Well, I do think you need to distinguish between newspapers and electronic broadcasting. So I think if you think of radio, local TV, and newspapers, radio, for the most part, stopped doing local news as a business model years ago, because in a lot of ways, local TV and newspapers took what was that province. So there is a systemic, irreversible decline in the newspaper business, and it's a function of technology, right? I mean, technology has sort of displaced in a lot of ways the business model, and that same technology has provided so many more places for local advertisers to advertise. The largest threat to local journalism is Facebook and Google. The biggest piece of incremental growth in any kind of local ad revenue that those same newspapers and TV stations as well would have been taking is now going to Silicon Valley, in a pretty unreported and ununderstood issue writ large. Local broadcasting TV broadcasting has become really a lot more important. We think in a lot of ways, most of the really good broadcast companies were under the roof of a newspaper company until a few years ago. And those were typically larger newspaper enterprises than they were broadcasts, whether it was Gannett or Tribune or Bealo or Hearst or Scripps and Washington Post and on. It was thought of that the TV stations made the money and the newspapers did the journalism, when in fact, those were very good companies in doing local journalism. Today, we do more investigative reporting in the markets that I'm in than our local newspapers do. Not in each case, but writ large we do. We employ almost 3,000 journalists, right? And we take our job very seriously. I had really 20 years on the editorial side and now 20 years on the business side. The purpose of our company is serving the greater good of the communities we serve. But that said, which is really important to this conversation, the business model of local journalism with broadcasting too is under the same risks. And I think for what I would say, you didn't ask me, but I'll give a political answer. I think what's really important for people and regulators to understand, and it's not typically politically correct often, but we don't compete against the TV station across the street. We compete against AT&T, Facebook, and Google. For what my stations, our stations, not my stations, have won more national investigative awards than any electronic, including the networks, company in this country. We are doing the kind of investigative journalism that Allison's talking about. We cover the state legislatures, not as much as we should, but whether it's making people safe from the groundwater at the Hanford plant in southeast Washington state to a nationwide sex trafficking ring in young girls that we just won an award for last week, we invest a lot in that. But our ability to do that is based on having scale. If I just have a family business of 6 TV stations, I can't do that. And so right now, the issue of local broadcast consolidation is a political topic because of one company that's out there in the press right now. But I will tell you, these other companies I just mentioned and our company, we don't do centralized editorial. Every station in their market makes their own editorial decisions. Portland, Oregon could not be more different than San Antonio, Texas. Portland, Maine couldn't be more different than Phoenix, Arizona. We own stations in all those. We let them make their own editorial decisions. But to your question, it is under siege, and it's really important that people understand the business model issue isn't going to go away, and we can't count on billionaires and their philanthropy to save it.
Allison, representing SPJ, do you agree with what Dave's saying? Do you see something different when you're looking at the actual journalists with the pen and paper and cameras in hand?
I think for us, we have had some very successful partnerships. We represent 7,000 journalists, down from roughly 10, 11,000 before, because so many of our members have moved into public relations communications or what have you. Not that they can't be members of SPJ, but we've lost a lot. But we represent more journalists as an organization by far than any other organization in the country. And what we've seen is an increase of freelance journalists in our membership. So people who are no longer working for the Gannett's, the Detroit papers, or who used to work in a 2-newspaper town, very few of which exist today. But back to Google and Facebook, we have had some successful partnerships with them in terms of teaching journalists in mid-size and smaller markets, and in some large markets, but mostly small and mid-size markets, how to use Facebook and Google's tools to search for information, to verify information, because verification journalism is very big now. You have a lot of, or some people, who may pull information off of the web and not check to see if that photo has been doctored, if the photo is real at all, if the source is real. But what we are hearing, and it's quite kind of funny because this is a little bit off from the question you asked. On the way here, I received an email from a person who is not a member of SPJ. She's a journalist, an award-winning journalist out in California, I believe. And she sent this long email introducing herself and saying, I've won all these awards for investigative journalism, but today I don't know what to do because I feel like my profession is under attack. I feel like people are not taking me seriously. People are slamming doors. People feel that it's okay to take my camera away from me. What is SPJ doing? What are other organizations doing to stop this propaganda and attack on journalists? For a long time, journalists have not, and still I would argue today, and maybe my colleagues don't agree, have not really stuck up for themselves. Because our job, we're always taught, you do your job, you check your facts, you go to work, report the story, and it's not our job to sort of be in the politics or be out holding the protest signs. But we are seeing more and more of our members saying, okay, if we don't speak up for ourselves and if we don't defend our profession, then who will?
Kate, Do you feel that when you come into these hallowed halls every single day?
I think we're pretty lucky on Capitol Hill. The Capitol Hill is my favorite place to cover. It's been the best beat, I think, by far of anything I've ever done, because you have incredible access to the principals. You can walk up to any member of Congress and ask them any question, and they can say, I don't want to answer you, or call my press secretary or whatever. But you have the ability to go up to them and ask. I think in this last year, especially year and a half, we have seen some incremental encroachments on that specific freedom here, and I know that, you know, we work very hard with the galleries to be represented and have a, you know, make sure that the First Amendment is being respected here on Capitol Hill. I think what has changed, something very significant, is that news organizations are standing up more for each other. And I think it's really important that we have each other's back. We're competitors. I want to scoop my competitors, but if someone, you know, BuzzFeed News was blacklisted from covering Trump campaign events during the 2016 election, and us and a few other news organizations, and it was about being really vocal about that, and not just for us, but for other news organizations. And when we see that happening to not us, making sure we're out there as a voice saying this isn't okay.
The idea that the president is referring to fake news as things that he disagrees with, and then there is disinformation, and that's all being lumped together in the same area. You know, at the museum, we've had our highest visitorship over the last 2 years. People are more engaged than ever before on the conversation of press and the free press. But when it comes to fake news, it almost is tossed off as, well, what about fake news? Well, you know, it's a funny thing, but for those of you who are doing the job every day, is there a difference in the climate to what you're dealing with every single day in your job, Allison? Kate?
Oh,
Kate,
no,
go
I
ahead.
was
Why don't you start?
just going to say it's so much harder for you know, if you make a mistake in an article, that would, you know, normally just take a simple correction, to have people screaming fake news. I mean, that is a steady attack on the press, and something that I still don't think we fully know how to kind of deal with that.
I used to be Washington bureau chief for Detroit News, and my staff covered Congress and the Michigan delegation and whatnot. And I would hate to be down in the press building today with the staff having to work, or in any newsroom really, because I think it's the time's different, and journalists are having to do more with less, and layoffs and whatnot. You know, I'm just coming back to the United States after many years abroad. And when I worked in Vienna, Austria, my job for the nonprofit there is ED, was to fight for press freedom around the world. So the obvious people, the Gambia, Turkey, Ethiopia, I cannot tell you how disheartening it is to have the people mention the United States when talking about some of these other countries. And when you have leaders of other countries or members of their embassy make offhand jokes about how it's okay for them to treat journalists a certain way because our country is not much better, the leader of our country is saying certain things. And I think that is bad. When we have 12 journalists attacked so far this year, 3 who've had equipment seized, 1 who was murdered last...
Domestically. I mean, that's
domestically,
right.
in the United States.
Yeah, this is the idea that it's foreign correspondents. These are domestically working
something
journalists.
That is sort of unheard of. I mean, it had been many, many years since we had a journalist killed on American soil. And that was out in California, and he was murdered, and it became a really big deal, and they found out who killed him and everything, a gentleman by the name of Chauncey Bailey. But to have equipment taken by regular people who are attacking journalists or not allowing journalists to cover people, it's amazing. I think to me and to all journalists and to all people who care about the First Amendment, freedom of the press, when it comes to fake news is not news because it's fake. It's fiction. So I think people, we've allowed this phrase to seep into our society and to take hold. When journalists do, people need to understand, regular Jane and Jack, that journalists do not go to work every day and say, let me see what I can make up today. Let me see what fake news can come from my newspaper so I can risk the chance, or radio or TV, of being fired. And that's why I think it's important for us to educate the public again about what we do and how we do it, et cetera.
What about in the situation of Senator Hassan, who told us and reminded us about the political cartoonist who's being fired because he's too provocative? So, you have attacks from the public, you have attacks from the president, but then when you have attacks from within, how does that change the dynamic? Dave, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I don't know all the details around that, but I think that sounds like an issue of what the ownership group was. And you've had newspapers owned by private families as long as Ben Franklin could go back, right? And owners, right or wrong, put editorial influence sometimes on newspaper coverage. And I think that's why, frankly, still today there's a legacy. Locally, newspapers aren't trusted as much as local TV because we're not in the editorial business. I think that. But I just wanted to add on to your question. We do have local reporters out there in the heartland that have been spit on, and they are seeing hostilities that they never saw before for all of the reasons you can kind of imagine. But the flip side of that is, to the point you made earlier about museum visits, we also see that I think people are starting to really a certain section of the population is starting to value journalism more than they ever have before. I think a lot of the attention is around national media, right, and national media coverage, but local as well, right? And I think that, back to the issue of fake news and social media, I think people have started to realize that even if they're not terribly informed news consumers, maybe social media is not the best place to be finding the truth. And I think it's a really interesting involvement. I remember when Chairman Janikowski became head of the FCC under President Obama's first term, and there was an idealistic view of his office, and he hired a guy who I think did a great job, named Stephen Waldman, looking at the state of local media. But there was an idealist, utopian view that even maybe I shared a little bit at the time, that this free crowdsourcing internet would lead to this great educated population. And how's that working for us, right? Because what has happened is, right, and this is about technology again, is that technology has allowed us all to stratify ourselves off into groups of people that we just like us, right? So I could go on Facebook and be with my user group, and I really can feel really smart because I can give some opinion, and everybody agrees with me, all right? But I'm not learning a damn thing. And I think people are starting to wake up to that.
So the idea that the internet was going to bring us this diversity of minds and diversity of thought is happening, but we're going to the folks who agree with it.
I think it's the fascinating thing is it has brought a diversity of thought, views, and opinions, but it's led to less, there's no filter of facts through which it goes through.
Amy, is that what you're finding with Pew Research Center?
It's a really challenging environment, and there are a number of different elements that are environment and a number of different elements that are all at play and are sort of piling up to leave us in a situation that we're in today. One of which is that in addition to now having the vast majority of Americans, of U.S. adults, getting at least some of their news online, that's all different types of people that are in that mix. We also have heightened political nature in our country with greater political divide and greater political animosity across the aisle, which when you think about when you're in the online space, that opens it up to all kinds of different types of information and content producers. 30% of Americans were getting some of their 2016 election news directly from the campaigns themselves. So it's everything from political leaders to advocacy groups to traditional types of news organizations to others that are pushing this information that in many cases is coming at people as opposed to people seeking it out themselves. So the ability of an individual to then parse through everything that's in that space can be extremely challenging. We did a study that actually just came out yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, that asked people to be able to distinguish between factual statements and opinions in the news. And they were given a series of different statements, and what we found there was very large degrees of difference in that ability, depending on one's characteristics. For example, the digital savvy, those who are more politically aware, those who are have more trust in the news media, much more able to correctly distinguish between these two than were those that in the other groups of those categories. And so there's a lot that's happening at the same time, even though roughly 2/3 of Americans agree that misinformation is a problem and is causing confusion about the basic facts around current events and issues. When we pose the question to people of, would you prefer that the government take steps to address misinformation online if it means it could potentially put some limits on one's access to publish and access the information and news that they want, versus not having the government take steps in order to fully protect those freedoms? The public balances to the side 60% to 40% of wanting to protect the freedoms and not having the government take steps. So that idea of freedom to access and publish information is one that is very much at the heart still of most Americans in this country. It changes a little bit if you ask it of technology companies, where the balance shifts to having some action be taken.
Kate, how does this affect the idea that people can go online and see whatever they want? How does it affect how you're doing your work at BuzzFeed?
Yeah, I mean, we live online, right? And much of our audience comes to us through Twitter, through Facebook, through other tech platforms. What we have invested in is a specific team of people who are committed to debunking falsehoods that pop up online. So things that go very viral that aren't true, having a team of people to literally report on that and fact check.
So you refer to them as reporters, not fact checkers?
I mean, they are reporters. Yeah.
They're reporters.
Yeah.
One and the same. Because I think we also hear when somebody's giving a speech and CNN says, oh, we have our fact checkers on this. They're all the same thing. These are people who are looking for the truth and making sure that the right information is getting out.
And we do spend a lot of time making sure that those articles, those pieces debunking false information are prominent on our platform, especially if something has gone, super viral.
So if people are leaving newspapers but there is still trust in the news, and people are going online to hear what they want to hear, and the president is tweeting and bypassing the press altogether, is it time for the business model to be totally blown up and started over again?
I mean, I can
absolutely not.
I can say it's certainly not working. Yeah. It's yet to be found a way to actually be able to earn a profit in a traditional manner that does not involve some sort of external financial support that's not self-generated. Mm-hmm. The television business is still earning revenue, although what's really transitioned at this point to digital is text. It's starting to happen with video, but you still have, when we ask a double-sided question of asking people about their preference of reading, writing, watching, and reading, listening, watching versus, and then the platform question, most watchers are still going to TV. That's starting to shift, particularly among the young people, so that the question of that revenue structure is not quite as busted yet as the newspapers are. But there's not been a solution at this point.
Allison, you had a pretty visceral response.
Yeah, I think I hate when we paint this broad brush. Mm-hmm. We did this study, or we saw this, because what we're seeing is for the free newspapers that you get from the little corner that are this thick with more advertising than most newspapers in that small town might have combined, if there are two newspapers, people pick those up and they read them. Mm-hmm. They like the investigative pieces, they like the entertainment pieces, they want to know where the fair is, what bar is having 2 for $1. Those things are still popular and people are reading them, and amazingly, they're not so much online. They count on people picking them up out of the free things. We found that when we've talked to a lot of our members, that when people say, we don't like the press, they're talking about the big 5 or 6. They're talking about CNN, Fox News, Washington Post, New York
They're also
Times.
talking about commentators a lot.
And commentators.
Right.
And but when you say, oh, so you don't like the person at the Morning Advocate in Baton Rouge? Oh, no, that's my local newspaper. They've been around since my mom was, and we still get it delivered. So I think that we have to be careful, because I think that there are some communities and some areas and some minority newspapers, niche publications that are making it work. Is it hard? Yes. And I think it's really hard to find people to work at these places because, salaries are kind of low. But I think that people are finding new ways to get listeners. Podcasts, very, very, very popular. And some of the smaller newspapers. So I would be careful. When TV came, people said, oh my God, we're not gonna have radio anymore. Mm-hmm. And what radio had to do was really sort of reinvent itself a little. And we still have radio. In fact, radio is the biggest media in the world because it's cheap, it's portable. So outside of U.S. borders, in the entire world, it is it's the way people get their news, most people, especially in developing countries. So I'm like this huge optimist. There will be fewer papers, we've seen that, fewer journalists, of course, but I don't think newspapers will die completely. There are people who want to feel it in their hands. It may be thinner or whatever.
Everybody has the Capitals.
There are people who want to cut out an obituary and put it on their
Stanley
refrigerator.
Cup, we got to have that in our basement.
So I just don't think, and I think this is particularly true in some of the more rural and smaller communities around the country.
Dave?
Yeah, I think I don't know about blowing up the business model because what's on the other side, but I think the business models have to evolve, right? And I think it's incumbent upon us in leadership positions in media to find ways to evolve that business model. I mean, the point earlier, it's not a zero-sum game, but like TV, what's the definition of TV today, right? This is a TV. Right, I actually watch my own channels live on YouTube TV on here. But to the earlier points, there's obviously a continued fragmentation of all consumer behavior. I think one of the key problems for the newspaper and television industry in our country is that the truth of the matter is the journalism isn't what drove the economics in the past. That great front page investigative reporting was actually paid for by the classified ads and the sports columnists, et cetera. And frankly, in the newspaper business, the quality of the journalism didn't have a big variable on the quality of the revenues of that newspaper, unfortunately. It's less so, it's more so in TV because we have competitors in the market and the quality of our content is relevant to what our percentage of revenues are. But even if you go back to the early 80s and the early days of cable, there were 3 TV stations in the market, and we were given this market share. So we didn't really have to be great at content. I think today, and I've got 250 people at our headquarters in Tyson's here today, continuing to work on content innovation. If we don't make content compelling, right, the younger people in this room are going to have absolutely zero interest in consuming our content. So if the overall content's not compelling / almost entertaining parts of it, better have the Stanley Cup, better have Ovechkin partying in Georgetown, right? If you want to bring people to your platform to hear those important investigative stories about how the legislature is gerrymandering the House districts in your city, in your state. So I think we have to really be a lot more proactive about being great at content, and that's counterintuitive as revenues decline. But I think in this new world of technology, but newspapers and TV had a distribution advantage before. It was impenetrable. Today, it's a meritocracy, so we've got to be great at content. But investigative journalism is content more people want from us.
And Kate, at BuzzFeed, who still seems like the new kid on the block, although you've been around for
a bit.
For a long time, actually. So the idea that you're the young, shiny, you're the trailblazer who's changing the dynamic. How do you get people to know that you do serious investigative work at the same time?
Well, I mean, we do serious investigative work that gets laws changed. We've been Pulitzer Prize finalists for the last 2 years. Melissa Segura, who works out of Chicago, she did amazing work on exposing this corrupt cop and freed quite a few people from life sentences in jail. I mean, I think it's doing that work that has impact on people's lives that people will pay attention to. And yeah, you can still come to BuzzFeed for the fun stuff, and that's great. We want you to do that. And right next to it will be an investigative piece that we want you to click on and read.
Do you think of the fun stuff as like the classified acts? Like,
yeah, I mean, well, I don't think that BuzzFeed would think of it as like the classified ads, but I do think that it is not bad to draw in an audience. And wherever that audience is coming in, we'll take it.
We talked a little bit about President Trump and his disdain for the press. Let's talk about President Obama. I think, a couple of years past, it's this idea that, oh, well, all the press was best friends with President Obama, and he loved them back. Was that the case? Kate?
No.
Remind us what it was like, that
Yeah.
how much has stayed the same and how much has changed.
I mean, I think I was on a panel a few weeks ago where this came up, where someone asked, you guys were all so nice to Obama, and I don't think that was true. I think the norms were so different, and that there were norms that existed. And so the press behaved in a way, in a certain way, and the Office of Communications that existed under President Obama behaved in a certain way, and everyone kind of knew the rules, and now there are no rules. Like, we just don't have any rules. We don't know who to talk to. You can talk to 5 different people in the Trump administration and get 5 different answers. They publicly are giving 5 different answers, so it's very hard to kind of, when Obama was rolling out an initiative or an executive order, there were weeks of lead up to it, background briefings, things that it was all, everyone was on the same page. So it made it easier, but also more difficult because they really wanted to control the message.
Because they were really on the same page.
They really wanted to control the message, and so if you went off message or a reporter went off message, it was not a pleasant experience, to deal with them. And the president wanted to control the message. So, I mean, they sort of started doing audio broadcasts from the West Wing and trying to get their own, doing not dissimilar things and Trump tweeting, except it was a little more structured, obviously, but getting their own message direct, bypassing the journalists. That definitely started with Obama.
Allison.
And there were also press freedom violations in terms of saying we're going to hand out photos and not let photographers come in and take pictures. Issues surrounding sourcing and whistleblowing, protecting whistleblowers for reporters, phone tapping. So there were issues in that administration as well in terms, just plain out press freedom issues when it came to the media.
Yeah, they were amongst the worst ever in terms of, the Freedom of Information Act and other issues in terms of reporters' freedom. But eventually, the Justice Department did back down. I mean, I think that Justice Department was going further than any Justice Department ever had in terms of cracking down on reporters, being able to protect their sources. But eventually, they did back down.
Amy?
I would add that even, prior to Obama, I mean, the tension between the presidency, the administration, and the press is one that's existed, through the course of our country, and is also sort of at the core. We've actually looked at the many of the past presidential campaigns, and if you each time there was a little advancement in the channels for information flow, there was another step taken to go directly to the public. If you even think back to the radio addresses, those are ways to bypass the media and to have your voice heard directly to the public. So these steps, and the first Obama campaign was one that really took sort of leaps and bounds forward in that direction. We have a question that we ask about the watchdog role, which is basically that, the news media keeping an eye on elected leaders to help keep them from doing things they shouldn't. Is that a good thing, or does it prevent them from doing their job? And one of the things that asking that question recently shows is how much more the political divide is playing into people's views about that relationship and how that moves. There has been strong support for that, even though there have been shifts depending on whose party is in power. There's generally, a majority of both that support that to support the watchdog role. And what we saw in January of 2016 during that primary campaign was that both parties at about 3/4 supporting that watchdog role. A year later, there ends up being a 47 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans, so that there's still just about half of Republicans that are in support of it, but extremely wide gap in the value of that role. So
is Twitter the new fireside chat?
Maybe.
Or we'd have to work on our misspellings first. But.
It's certainly a channel that's been used by this president and this administration to go directly to the public.
It's a short chat.
It's a short chat. Other social media has been used as well, and email campaigns, on both sides as well.
But you have to pay attention to it. I mean, I think there's a feedback loop. Why is the press, reporting on the president's tweets? Well, he's the president. And I think it's important to put the tweets in context. I think it's important to say this is not true when there's a tweet that is not true, but I'm going to report on the president's tweets because he is the president.
And Dave, how does social media and tweets and things like that feed into the news cycle? Is there a cycle anymore, or it's just...
No, I think to Kate's point, it's absolutely newsmaking, and it's probably, it's the president at his most unbound and probably most authentic, right? So you are getting your unfiltered views of your president, so they may be the most relevant communications for journalists to cover. But yeah, I think social media, it's interesting. The Obama administration used social media well as a campaign, but they never used Twitter to the effect they used between two ferns, but not bypassing. It's absolutely a way and an effective way to bypass traditional media.
Let's talk about the future. The average salary, the average salary for a journalist, according to the Pew Research Center, is in the mid-40s for a journalist. How can we lure the best and the brightest to this field if we're not paying as much as the salary of any other job?
My question is, mid-40s for what? Newspaper, broadcast? Because I think there's a big difference, and there always has been, in what newspaper people are paid in the beginning and what broadcast people are paid, and by far what radio people are paid in the beginning. And I'd be interested in finding out, when you say mid-40s, and then are you talking mid-market, small market?
Yes.
Or are you saying that people at the Washington Post make $40,000?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure where that came from. I think it was probably a local television newsroom, not anchors, is what I'm thinking. But
the point is that journalism is not super lucrative.
I think it's a local TV, non-news, non-anchor personality.
Absolutely.
Let me take that one.
You're
First of all, journalism has never been a lucrative profession. Right. All right, we'd all like it to be. All right, so it has been a calling, much like teaching. Right now, the gap between teachers and journalists and some other callings obviously has grown. But in television newsrooms today, the old days of the highly paid anchor sitting on the set, reading scripts provided them by somebody else, and then there's this other group of people called reporters in progressive companies went away some time ago. Very few of those still exist. There may be a handful of legacy people. Everybody's a reporter. Everybody's a journalist, right? And the problem with the business, with the technology model of TV stations was we had in the past, we had to have too many people allocated to getting the product on the air, back-end engineering, yada, 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 and not enough a percentage of the staff were journalists. Technology is now enabling us to actually, we have more people, we don't have more people in our company, we have way more journalists today than we did 3 or 4 years ago. Right? And that's through reallocating, embracing technology, reallocating resources. Newsrooms were very resistant to, quote-unquote one-man bands. Well, I bet Kate,
can you tell us what a one-man band is?
Yeah, it's just somebody that,
not anymore, at one point.
shoots their own story, right? So, now the technology allows me, this is a better quality camera than what I was buying from my photographer, my photojournalist for $40,000 15 years ago. Right? So now it doesn't mean you want to do all your storytelling on these devices, but sometimes it's just about getting the video. So if everybody in our newsroom knows how to shoot video, right, then video is like text, right? Text is used for different things. Well, we'd never think twice about everybody in a newsroom being able to use a word processor. One person might win a Peabody or a Pulitzer with it, and the other one might just be writing emails, but it's different tools for different tasks. And I think we have to embrace, newsrooms have to embrace change faster than we have. And that's not aimed at newsrooms. I'm part of that. But I do think we've been our own worst enemy in not embracing technology faster. And I watched newspapers and newspaper companies and newspaper staffers just resist embracing how technology could actually help them do their jobs better. And we need to embrace it.
I think Allison disagrees with you.
I know that there are people who say journalists walking around with holes in their shoes and not making a lot of money. I don't know these journalists in print. Because in print, if you start off at $45,000 a small newspaper, most people's goal is to get to the New York Times. So the higher you climb, the more money you make, and you get into the six figures, or near 90 or whatever, and you're doing okay. I do think that it's not the same in electronic media, because we also have people who are in broadcast, and that their pay is not the same as it might be for a print person who did all these internships and then started off at the Tampa Tribune or Miami Herald or whatever. I think that the thing that's important is new journalists have to do, just like David said, a lot more than journalists had to do before. In my heyday, when I was a reporter, That's what I did. I covered housing or city hall or whatever. I didn't have to shoot, tweet, blog, and all that stuff at the same time. A photographer went with me, and there was separation of duties. That's not the case, as we all know today. Although we do have editors in the newsroom who do not go out and report stories. Their job, like the publisher, doesn't go out and report. So there's still some separation, and you still have some people who are photographers, and the photographers have to be willing to and ready to write when necessary, but I think that's always been the case. So you have to do so much more. So people coming into the business, I think the pay doesn't seem as much because you're doing 5 jobs. And the news cycle is 24/7.
And so then how does burnout figure into this?
If I could just jump in, I just jump in, though. We'll have a healthy debate on this. I find that to be generational. Yeah. When I find that some of the best young journalists in our company, they don't think twice about doing all those things, because that's how they live their life at home. They multitask on devices, and they don't think it's a ton of extra work. It's totally natural for them to write a story and distribute it on multiple platforms. And I find that my own generation has a harder time with that. We see a huge divide.
No, we don't disagree. I think that's true. But my staff, most of whom happen to be under age 32, that the 24-hour news cycle, I mean, they want life. They want personal life. That becomes a bit of an issue.
Yeah.
And now it's 24/7.
Yeah.
It's always been the case that you could be called at midnight because there was a shooting, a fire, or whatever. You get up and you go. But this is sort of nonstop. There are more voices, more sources. It's easier to get a hold of sources because of the internet and LinkedIn and being able to find their profile and that sort of thing.
Kate, you had something to
add? Yeah, people aren't leaving the industry because there's not enough money. It's because of burnout. And I don't know the answer to that, except that as someone who runs a newsroom of 26 people, I am very, very conscious of trying to not burn people out, because as Allison was saying, the cycle is so crazy, and so you go and you think, oh, I'll do this, but then you can't, you got to go. So it is a calling. I know, because I left for a year. I went and tried to do communications and then business side of journalism, and I hated all of it. I just wanted to be a reporter.
You missed the burnout.
Yeah.
So
something's happening and you're
I'm
not
a crazy
there.
person, and came back. So yeah, I mean, I think it is like a combination of both being a calling and trying not to completely just have it own your brain.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions. I want to make sure we leave time for that. Sir in the tan suit, I think we have microphones up here too. Can you come up a little bit further and we can get those microphones to you, because we want to make sure the folks who are watching on the live stream can hear your questions. We'll get you a microphone, and if there's somebody on this side, There's a gentleman right behind you, if you wouldn't mind handing him that other microphone. You go over there to the, yeah, I'll air traffic control you that way. Go ahead.
Thank you. John Howes from the Computer and Communications Industry Association. I wanted to build off a comment from the gentleman. How do you pronounce your last name?
Luigi.
Luigi, sorry. You mentioned a company that is seeking to change the media landscape, and let's just name it, it's Sinclair. This company is seeking to reach vast parts of the country. Their merger is currently under review at the FCC. And one of the things that's particularly of concern with this merger is the effect on localism, which is something that's very important for the communications landscape, something that the panel discussed earlier. They have a pretty clear business practice of buying up local stations, firing the on-air and off-air talent. And these are communities that those stations are supposed to serve, that are served by many people in this room who are staffing members of Congress. So I wanted to see if maybe the panel could discuss that merger and the implications of Sinclair and their business practices. Thank you.
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not going to, opine on Sinclair, but I'll just talk about, I named a whole other bunch of companies in addition to our own. All those companies, let's just think of them: Cox, Graham, former Washington Post, Scripps, Hearst. I'm leaving them all out. They're the and us are the vast majority of broadcasters in this country. None of them have any centralized editorial. And the irony about that particular company is the centralized editorial they do have is actually not much quantity of their news time, but it is obviously very controversial for understandable reasons. It is the spirit of our FCC license and our obligation that local people make local editorial decisions about the mores and issues in their community, okay? We have reporters all across South Texas today. We're in San Antonio, we're in Tyler, we're in Waco, we're in Houston, all covering this issue of the immigration issue with kids. It is not going to be done by somebody at my corporate office, okay? And the values about those issues, and there are very differing viewpoints about the immigration issue in those different communities. We're going to cover it independently. We're going to tell people things they don't want to hear, but they're going to hear voices from their own community, and those decisions are going to be made by people in those communities. And that's how all those other companies operate too. So what's painful to me is that the dialogue around that merger you're talking about is that type of consolidation is exactly what kind of it is from a financial standpoint, what needs to happen to keep the business model of local broadcast journalism alive. And let me tell you, it's important that the local broadcast model of journalism stays alive in this country. To the conversation we had earlier, I got 3,000 trained fact people, and they're patriots. They're patriots in the sense they love their country, okay? They don't get to wave the flag because they need to be objective on all sides. But they love their country. But they're competing against Facebook and Google. And we need to be able, these companies need over time to be able to consolidate to compete in a fragmented technology world. So what I'm saying is it pains me that the press around that particular company may have impacts on the ability of great local broadcast journalism companies to do what they need to do to compete in the future.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So in terms of the mainstream media, I think one point that has been brought up in the past few years that is a good point is that it seems the quality of news has kind of declined, maybe possibly due to profits. For example, some people might rather click on or watch a headline about Stormy Daniels than about wealth inequality in America. So how do you feel that profits play into a fair and robust news? And do you believe that in the coming age or in the current age of digitization and a lot more access to regular people, can profits still inherently align with good and robust news?
Allison.
I want to say one thing on Sinclair. And it's not about the merger, but the Society of Professional Journalists has been very vocal and very public about being not happy with comments that have come from the leadership of Sinclair about journalists and fake news and how no print reporters ever write any stories that are ever true, and some of these sort of public statements. And so no matter what happens with that deal, we hope that this sort of language will stop especially from our own. Coming from our own, it hurts even more because it jeopardizes the work that local broadcasters do. Having said that, I think there's a big joke always about whether or not journalists, and it's like an old joke, whether or not journalists write things that journalists want to read, as opposed to what other people, like average people, want to read. And I think that with Facebook and Google and some of the online platforms and BuzzFeed early on especially, that a lot of media are reevaluating how they play news and how often they play it, and whether or not there should be some sort of relief on the front page. For example, if it's a newspaper, something that is more entertainment-based or news you can use, to use Gannett's old phrase, sort of thing. And I think people are reevaluating that, and I think it's really important. I was at a discussion not long ago, and we were looking at a very big newspaper's front page, and they had 6 stories, and 4 of those stories were basically the same story. They were all Russia stories from a different point of view. And so there was, if you care to only read one of those stories, you might not even get to the inside because you were so bombarded with just that. So I think that more people are paying attention and trying to figure out a way to balance the news, to give people news that's important, news that should be on the record, but to also take into consideration news that people in the newsroom might not think is the most important or exciting news, but that the general public cares about. And all of this with fewer journalists, decreased features sections. Many newspapers have gotten rid of their magazine section where they would carry this sort of stuff. We only have a handful of gossip columnists still around in the United States, who are, by the way, very powerful people at the newspapers where they work, because gossip columnists are powerful in New York and in Boston, for example, and Chicago.
Amy?
I would just add, this does not speak directly to the question, but if you think about social media and the role of social media with news, we now have 2/3 of the public that's getting some of their news through social media. If we think back to the beginning of each social media network and channel, none of them had news to start. None of them had news as a part of what they began with. That includes Twitter. They were social. They were social platforms for people to connect with each other, to have conversations, to be social. Each and every one of them has had news become a part of their platform, some to a larger degree than others. As they became more popular, as they became used more, as people spent more time there over the course of the day, news is something that people look for over the course of the day. So if you're going to be dipping in and out, that's going to be a part of what people are looking for. Now, there are pluses and minuses to any of these developments. People can be exposed to news and events that are happening in our country, around the world, things like the Boston bombing, in a way that they may not have known about it, at least for a long time prior. So there are pros and cons to the balance sheet of the different levels of exposure to news in the digital arena.
So I would say I disagree with the first premise of your question, and I agree with the second half. I actually don't agree that quality of news has gone down. So I've been running this business a long time. I think our stations right now are doing the best work they've ever done. I'm very close to NBC News. We're the largest distributor for NBC, and I've worked with them for a long time, both on the editorial side and now in the business role. I remember about a 5-year period before 9/11 when NBC Nightly News was all OJ or all, there was a Hill staffer here who was killed in the late 90s, and it was all every day, just as a drama saga. And then the summer before 9/11, there was lots of stories about shark attacks. And, since then, and there was no foreign coverage. Network news in the 90s really had no foreign coverage. You watch NBC News today, watch what coverage from Richard Engel overseas and his counterparts on the other networks. I think some of the best journalism ever on the national level is being done. But to your point, mainstream media, and to Kate's earlier point about opinions, there's this great, even when we have this conversation on NBC, MSNBC is something very different than NBC News, but not to the public. My stations with peacocks on the side of them that go to a rally in St. Louis, that's Rachel Maddow in their mind. And I'm sure Fox stations go through the same thing. And to the second point, as things, it used to be we had a very broad audience that was just sort of given to us because of that distribution advantage. It was actually more rational back then to try to entertain them with Hollywood news. Today, it is a smaller slice, and these people we have today want meaningful information. There is no business reason for us to do Kim Kardashian, all right? There's plenty of that out there, and that crap is being consumed on the internet, right? So I actually think the way the world has evolved, there's less of that garbage on Main Street. But I do think the problem is that there's a lot. I actually think there's a different problem, and it's based on the bias of this town and New York. A lot of us in this industry have only lived in New York, D.C., or in those corridors, or maybe L.A. and San Francisco, and don't, and I'm going to sound like a, hillbilly elegy here, don't understand mainstream America, where local news has much higher ratings, and it's a different mindset out there. And I think the Russia probe is a good example. Russia's important, but I sometimes think Russia is a matter of fatigue when you've got an opioid crisis out there that's massive, that you've got the health care bills, I know as an employer, going back up this year. So there's these things facing America that I think when you sit inside this echo chamber, especially of this town, decision makers in media can be jaded and just drive too much the things that don't relate to the lives of the American people.
Allison, and then we'll do final thoughts.
And something that's like brilliant to piggyback on the investigative journalism, there's so much more focus on investigative journalism today. And because of the internet, and this is a fabulous thing, more journalists are able to talk cross-border. So you have things like Panama Papers or even state-to-state investigations that are happening where journalists are collaborating from different media houses, and some of them are freelance, some might be from Der Standard in Austria, and some might be whatever from New York Times or smaller publications, and they're coming together to do these bigger pieces. And this is having phenomenal impact in financial areas and in other areas when it comes to the impact of these stories. So I think there's lots more investigative journalism, because to do investigative journalism is not cheap, and it takes bravery. And that's why a lot of smaller, mid-sized newspapers can't do the really big projects, because it really is expensive, and you have to free up staff, not just the reporter, because not just the reporter does investigative journalism. There's a whole team. There's the editor, there's the photographer, the graphics. It's just not a one-man show, generally speaking. And so you have to free up people for long periods of time, which most companies can't afford to do. So when you partner and come together, and someone said earlier, get each other's backs in a different way, then we've seen tremendous work.
You can also just go to a website that does both. I think Kim Kardashian's actually a pretty important cultural figure right now, and I think that Stormy Daniels is a really important story.
Do you mean Kim or Courtney?
Kim. Okay. And like Stormy Daniels is a huge important story, right, with legal implications for the President of the United States. And Flint is a really important story. And so I think that news organizations need to figure out what works best for our audience, what is going to engage our audience. I know that we don't think about profit when we think about stories, but we think about what our audience wants to know about. And they want to know about all of those things.
Final question. Is there a role for Congress to play in the future of journalism? Amy, would you mind starting us off?
Well, I think if we go back to the question that I was referring to from the public's perspective, clearly the media are seen as the fourth estate. They're a key part of communication, and one of the things I think has been realized over the last couple of years is that how Americans are informed and to what degree they're informed about the events that are occurring in our country and the world is important, and it matters. And I think that is certainly there's been more awareness around that over the last couple of years. I do think one of the differences in the United States compared with other countries, I look a lot at and am involved in conversations around what's happening in Europe with questions of misinformation and steps that they're taking there. There is a difference here when it comes to the public's, the importance the public places on freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the degree to which the government would take steps that go against that or potentially go against it is something that is tricky to balance here. Dave?
Yeah, I think Congress needs to vehemently protect the freedoms of the press, right? And if any administration through the agencies, through Justice Department, start to impinge on that. Now you have this issue of what's the definition of a journalist, which we won't wade into. So I think they more than ever they should protect the freedom of reporters. And secondly, I think where Congress has created problems in the past is it's difficult for Congress often to stay current with the realities of a marketplace when you're talking about business models, and that's where I think next generation staffers can really help. But I was here 10 years ago when Congress, the Democratic Party, led the charge against allowing cross-ownership of newspapers and television. I think they'd like to have a redo on that if they really thought about it. The internet was already here. No company was going to dominate the messaging in a market, right? So we all had other sources, and that would have been helpful to the newspaper industry if it had been allowed. It's now about to be allowed, but it's way too late.
Allison.
This is an important question, so I actually wrote something down.
Wonderful.
I think the momentum last week by some members of Congress, lawmakers, to consider introducing the federal shield law is a very big deal, and it's a step in the right direction, because in order for journalists to do their jobs, they must be able to protect their sources. That's really important. And a federal shield law would be good for journalism and would be good for democracy, of course, to state the obvious. Congress and the White House can do more to acknowledge the important role of journalism in general and the important role that the press plays in stopping to fight fake news, for example, and stop fighting the media at every turn. And also, of course, to stop saying really bad things, that's the most polite way I could say it, about the journalists, and to allow journalists to do their jobs, to cover protests, public meetings, etc. We've seen way too many instances recently where journalists have not been allowed to come into a public meeting. We just had down south where if you are not from this community as a journalist, you can't come and cover a case there. But whatever way the federal government treats journalists, we have to remember that state and local governments will follow suit, as will people outside of our country. So we set the standard. We are the United States of America. It is in our Constitution. And I think we all have to remember the importance of freedom of the press. And we can be led by our legislators.
Yeah, and that's so well said. The whole world is looking.
That's right. Kate.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone says. I think it's about protections for journalists, not, I think legislation that would meddle in any kind of business is a very, very, very slippery slope and would not encourage that at all. But we've seen some really, really troubling incidents recently on the federal level of people taking people's phone records, and that's the kind of stuff that frankly scares the crap out of me. And so at every moment, legislators can talk about the importance of the press and why they're important. I think that's what they can do.
And if you've forgotten what the First Amendment says or need to know more information, you can always just walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and see it on the front of the museum and know why it's important. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to the Senator for convening this panel. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you, Kate.
Hey, it's nice meeting you too. Take care.